All right, this is the second video in the Understanding Our Environment series. So we're going to talk about environmental ethics and their perspectives and points of view. Now, when it comes to environmental science and just environmental questions, there are some really tough questions out there, and the answers to those questions per individual is going to depend on their environmental ethical viewpoint. So this is a very complex topic, and you could spend, years studying it. You could take psychology courses and all that. We're just going to touch very briefly on a few of the terms that you need to be familiar with and understand kind of how people generally view things so that you understand how to see what we're talking about. So, hypothetically speaking, let's say if we have a question, is it okay, say, for a poor farmer in South America to clear cut and burn the rainforest to grow crops for his family and for a living, for income. Okay, and your answer will depend on your environmental perspective, in your ethical perspective. It depends on your viewpoint. Okay, that farmer is probably going to say, yeah, this is totally okay. And that's why people there do it, because they don't have any other resources. So what else is he going to do? He's got to feed his family. He's got to make a living. And so in his mind, cutting a small chunk out of the rainforest is no big deal to him and is necessary for his survival. But someone sitting in New York City in a plush office or something has a very different perspective on that and sees it differently and says, absolutely not. That is not okay for them to do. And so this is an example of those very tough questions. I mean, what if is clear cutting a forest in Canada for oil okay if it creates jobs and helps pull us out of a recession and lets us be less dependent on oil, on foreign oil? Running out of room here, dependent on foreign oil. Well, if you're an American who's out of work and you've got hungry kids at home that you need to provide for, you're probably going to say yeah. But if you were healthily employed and you didn't have any issues with that, then maybe you would say no. Or if you're someone who's very into green energy and you drive, a solar car or a Tesla or something, you might say no, we don't need oil. I don't think we should get oil at all. And all these answers really go back to what is your ethical perspective. So let's review these and go through these really quick. So there's basically 5 ethical perspectives or viewpoints that you need to be familiar with. And your textbook does cover all of them, so you can go there for information as well. So the first ones we're going to go through are these ones, the 3 trisms, I termed them: anthropocentrism, biocentrism, and ecocentrism. And then there are 2 historical perspectives: conservation and preservation ethics. So let's go through each of these. So let's start out with the trisms. Trisms. Whoa, I just pushed a button on my... It's not what we want here. Sorry about that. Trisms. Okay, so we'll start with the anthropocentrist or anthropocentrism. An anthropocentrist is basically someone... Let's look at the word, by the way. That means people. So it's a people-centered viewpoint. So someone who only considers humans when making decisions. Someone who only considers humans when making decisions. So their point of view is if it benefits humans, then they're going to be for it. If it doesn't benefit humans, then they're going to be against it. Whether or not it hurts any other living being, they're only concerned about humans. Okay? They don't care about snakes or monkeys or elephants or whales or anything. All they care about are humans. How does this affect humans? And I'm going to make my judgment based on that. Now, there aren't a lot of anthropocentrists in the world anymore, but that used to be a very common viewpoint. How do natural resources benefit man? And if it benefits man, then we should probably do it. A more common viewpoint these days for most people is the biocentrist. Again, let's look at the word. Bio means life, all life. So a biocentrist is someone who considers all living things in their decisions. Someone who considers all living things. When making decisions. Okay, so you can see that the scope of view has gone from being much more narrow, just looking at humans, to kind of focusing out that viewpoint, saying, okay, well, anything that's living, I will consider. It's a much more holistic viewpoint. Okay, they're really considering, it might not harm anything big, but if it kills the lichen or the fungus in that ecosystem, then they're probably going to oppose that decision. So any living thing. And it's holistic, and also this viewpoint really stresses those connections. Okay, I mean, you know, killing a snake may not directly harm humans, but in the long run it probably will, because the snake therefore isn't going to be there to eat the rats, and the rat might be carrying the plague, and the plague might get on the human because the rat wasn't, or excuse me, the snake wasn't there. So there are all these complex connections that we always have to consider. So we have gone through anthropocentrist and biocentrist. So let's go through the last one here. And the last one, of course, is the ecocentrist. Now, eco refers to basically the ecosystem or the environment. And remember that environment considers or includes not only the living, but also the non-living. And so that is exactly what an ecosystem is the living and the non-living parts all encompassed into one. So an ecocentrist is someone who considers all living and all non-living things. Okay, so if the ecocentrist was presented with the question of should we chop down the boreal forest in Canada so that we can get oil and tar sands out, they might simply oppose it because it's destroying the fertile soil that's in that forest. Now, the soil isn't essentially alive, but that might be why they choose to oppose it, because they focus on both the living and the non-living things. So this is even one step further out. It's even more holistic and whole picture looking than the biocentrist. Now, to give you a, oops, one click too many. To give you a visual representation, your book has this picture in it. And so you're seeing the three viewpoints. Right here in the center, the purple squares the anthropocentrist, and of course, in their viewpoint, they're only looking at humans. They're not considering anything else outside that human scope. Now, the biocentrist, you're moving out, and notice everything in the light green area is living. You've got fish, you've got birds, you've got plants, fungus. All these things are living things, but they're only focused on the living things. The ecocentrist is the furthest out, and they're considering the overall ecosystem. Okay, the mountains, the lakes, the entire system, living and non. So those are the three trisms. Now let's move on to the historical viewpoints. There are basically two of them. We have the preservation perspective and the conservation perspective. And these two viewpoints were the first two to kind of emerge on how people viewed natural resources. And they're both associated with fairly famous people as far as the history of natural resources. So the preservation ethic, right, ethic underneath here, or perspective, is associated with John Muir. And if you don't know who John Muir is, you should. John Muir is the founder of the Sierra Club. He was a major naturalist, and he's also the one responsible for Yosemite National Park. Okay, that was basically his backyard, his stomping grounds. I just did a 6-day hike on what's called the John Muir Trail, which is a 210-mile section of the Pacific Crest Trail, and it starts over on the west side of Yosemite National Park and goes all the way down to Mount Whitney in the Southern Sierras. A girlfriend of mine and I did a 60-mile section, and she actually did the rest of the trail. And the area out there is just stunning and beautiful. And John Muir loved it so much out there. He and Teddy Roosevelt were actually good friends, had very differing viewpoints on natural resources, but he got Roosevelt out into the Sierras and took him hiking and all this and was like, look at this gorgeous area. We need to protect it. This is an immense natural resource. And he was a preservationist, and his idea was to preserve or set it aside. He wasn't looking to protect resources to benefit man other than for man to enjoy it without ever really using it, just to hike in it, to be in it, to enjoy it, okay, but not make use of it. Whereas this guy here, Gifford Pinchot, he was one of the guys who kind of started the U.S. Forest Service. Whoops, S. I don't know why I get doing Fish and Wildlife, USFS, and he was what's called a conservationist. Now think back to that term conservation and remember that it has a strong human component to it, and that's what Gifford Pinchot was all about. He thought natural resources were great, and he did want to save them, but he didn't want to save them as in preserving them. He wanted to sustain them. He wanted to use them, but use them wisely so that they would last for many generations of humans to use. So let's define these two terms here. We have the preservationist, preservation ethic, let's call it the preservation ethic here, and associated with John Muir. And basically, this ethic or this thought is that we should preserve or protect nature and our natural resources and set them aside, not use them, protect them. Keep, a good term to remember is keep the wild wild. Okay, that was John Muir's viewpoint. Whereas the conservation ethic associated with Gifford Pinchot, it's not Pinchot, by the way, it's Pinchot, silent T. His idea is that natural resources exist for humans to use and benefit from. To use and benefit from, but he emphasized that we need to use them wisely and sustainably. Sustainable use. Okay? All right, now there's a third name that you need to be familiar with, and that's this guy here, Aldo Leopold. And this is Leopold right here. And he is a very famous guy. He was a naturalist. And he worked for the U.S. U.S. Forest Service. And he actually worked in New Mexico. He was hired by them, and his job was to go out and do what was called large predator control. So they hired all these naturalists to basically go out into the New Mexican forests and mostly hunt wolves. The theory being that the ranchers down there were saying that wolves were killing their livestock and therefore putting their livelihoods in jeopardy, and they wanted the government to step in and do something and help. They said these large predators were getting out of control. And so the Forest Service stepped in and said, all right, fine, we'll hire these guys and we'll send them out there and have them kill some wolves and they won't take out your livestock anymore. And in addition to that, we'll also see some hoof stock increases in our populations and that'll make it better for hunters. So it's a win-win all around. And initially, Leopold was all for this. He agreed with the whole thing and he went out there and started hunting wolves. But as he continued on doing this a couple years, he kind of started realizing some changes in the overall system and balance of nature. And one of the big changes that he was noticing is that with the wolves being taken out, the deer populations were really skyrocketing and taking off. And he was realizing, well, there's some kind of, link going on between the two and something that needs to be studied. And there's a story that Leopold writes in one of his journals about the last time that he killed a wolf. He and some guys were hanging out on a mountainside and they were on a rock hanging out above a river. They were having their lunches and down by the river, a female wolf came out to get a drink of water. And so Leopold, just, instinctively doing his job, drew out his rifle and pulled the trigger and shot her. And so he and his buddies got up and they ran down the hill to go make sure she was dead and that they had killed her. And he writes about the green light in her eyes dying. He gets there and she's still alive. Her heart's just slowly, slowly stopping, and he sees this type of life oozing out of her, and he just had this epiphany. He says, I just, I can't do this anymore, it's not right. And he came up with this concept. This was kind of the spark that caught the concept of the land ethic. And so you need to understand who Aldo Leopold was and this concept of the land ethic. And basically, the land ethic, this idea that he came up with, is that he felt that humans needed to see themselves not as rulers or conquerors, but as members of the community, equal to all others. In other words, humans, okay, here's my human, la la, are here, and so are plants. This is my pathetic flower, and the soil, you know, and the birds. Tweet, tweet. Okay, and humans need to see themselves on equal footing. We're equal to the soil, and we're equal to the plants, and we're equal to the birds. We're not above any of them, and we need to understand that our actions have major and often delayed effects and consequences. And Leopold really understood this idea early on. In fact, after he had this green light dying in the wolf's eyes, he quit the Forest Service. He said he couldn't do it anymore, and he relocated his family. He quit altogether, and they moved out to a farm in Wisconsin, and he went out there to basically prove this concept of the land ethic. He bought a farm, and he didn't put any pesticides or anything like that on there. He just farmed it as if he were an equal member of his community, and he raised his whole farm that way. And he wrote a book called the Sand County Almanac, which was all about his experience on his farm in Wisconsin. If you have a chance, you should read it. Farm in Wisconsin. So those are the basic perspectives. Also, in the PowerPoint lecture, I gave you a link to a video where there's actually a ranch that is still today using this concept of the land ethic. As we are reintroducing wolves to areas as major predators, we are still trying to recover from having eradicated so many wolves. And we've been pretty successful in Yellowstone, but in New Mexico, we've been very unsuccessful. Getting the Mexican wolves reintroduced into that area has been a real struggle, and the wolves just continue to get shot and killed. And there's a lot of political controversy with that. So, kind of interesting there. All right, we'll pick up where we left off with video 3.